Okay, so we're starting with project 5 this time. This is our Distort Effects project. And if we just hit the space bar and do a preview here, you can see we have a movie in the background that has what looks like a telescopic sight moving around. The white shape that you can see in the center of that is actually the circle filter that we've already played with. So that's just dropped into the center and locked into the same motion as the sight itself. What we're going to do is take a look at a couple of distortion filters in here, which are brand new to After Effects 6. The first one is called Magnify. Now, if we come down to the timeline, we can see here that layer number 5 is called Magnify Solid. And if I go ahead and select that, you can see that there's no color inside the main window, even though it says here we have a white solid. But you can see on the right-hand side here, it is an adjustment layer. Okay, so we're going to use this to magnify through to the contents below, which will be all layers beneath this, and apply that effect using an adjustment layer. So let's add that effect to this layer. Let's go up to the effects palette. Let's highlight the word solid, and let's just type in mag, and that will bring up magnify. So double click, apply that, bring up the effect controls window, and we can see immediately that we have an enlarged zoom area here in the center of our composition, which if we pick it up and move it around, you can see it's almost like a small magnifying glass that we're just moving around screen. And it's a very, very simple tool to use. It just has some straightforward settings which we can briefly go over. If we have a look here, the default is set to a circle. We can choose a square as well. There's not many magnify tools that give you a square option, so that's a very interesting way of looking at things. Let me just undo that and undo again. Let's go back to a circle. We also have the center point, which is what we're dragging around there, but very importantly, we also have the magnification value. So if we click and drag on that, obviously it's going to increase the size of the pixels or decrease all the way down to 100% the size of the pixels we see through that area. And we're going to be able to animate this in just a short while. Now, if I set this up to quite a high value, let's go up for 200 or something, and move it across so we're viewing the car up here. Okay, see on the top left there. We can see that the car is quite fuzzy. Now, if I just zoom up 100% there, let's scroll down and hit Control J or Command J and go 100% quality. There is a little bit of degradation inside these pixels, and that's natural. We're obviously blowing pixels up here to 2.5 times their size. However, in the bottom of the Magnify palette, we have a menu that says Scaling, and that is set to Standard. We can choose to soften out those pixels very gently, and it almost applies a little blur to them, which just makes them look, oddly enough, a little bit sharper than they were. So it's just one of those settings that once you reach a certain magnification, you might want to apply that. The other option is also scatter, which I tend to use a little bit more if I'm using vectors and I'm enlarging up on vector paths here. The scatter edge just applies this small amount of noise to the edge and makes a very interesting effect. In this case, on pixels, it looks more like it's slightly frosted glass. So again, whichever one works for you, I'm going to set that back to soft because that's the effect I wish to see. Okay, now magnification, I don't need it to be that high. I'm going to bring it back down a little bit. And let's see the other settings that we have. Now, very importantly, obviously, we have the size, and that is the overall size of this circle right here. We can obviously drag that up or down to increase the preview area that we have. And again, we're going to set that and animate it in a second so it matches the size of the sight that moves around the scene, the small yellow one that you saw moving a second ago. We also have a feather edge here, which is very handy. It allows us to soften and diffuse the edge of the magnify, so it looks like we've almost got a raindrop that's on our film here, and we're just getting a small distortion in the center, but that blends out into that background, and obviously we can drag that around and see it. You get this lovely soft edge effect, which you can combine almost 2 pieces of footage together, one magnified and one in focus, just by overlapping that feathered edge. So again, another fun option to play with. I'm actually going to set that back down to 0 for this, because we don't need a feathered edge. And we also have blending modes here, which won't apply in this case really, because we are dealing with an adjustment layer here. But obviously if we had standard footage on this layer, we could use the enlarged area to add itself back down to the previous layer as well. So if I add this, what you can see there is it is applying through an adjustment layer, but don't forget you can do this on the standard one. You'll see that I'm taking the enlarged area and using a blending mode to combine it onto the one beneath. So in this case, we actually see a ghost of the car. And if we hit the space bar here, we can see them, 2 of them moving together, which is very interesting. Okay, but the blending modes will allow you to achieve all these different effects. Again, we're going to go right back to the basics here, and let's set it to normal. So all we're viewing is the overall magnification. Now, just like you saw on the shadow filter we used earlier, the radial shadow, you also have a resize. So if we applied this to a layer that was a little bit too small and we increase the size of this, we could say resize, and it would allow us to continue the magnify area beyond the dimensions of the layer. Now, that's pretty much all of the settings that we have to play with, but that doesn't mean that we can't animate them, and that's exactly what we're going to do. we're going to animate these so that they match the motion and the size and, cleverly enough, the magnification of the site that we saw moving around screen. So let me just zoom down again to 50% using the comma key for that, and I'm going to change here to half quality. And again, if we just scrub the timeline, you can see that this site moves around the screen, reaches a point down here, and then all of a sudden it zooms up to a larger magnification, as if it just went past the car there and said, oh, let's zoom up and have a look at this in close view. Well, we're going to make this all match the motion of our magnification. Now, before we do that, there's another layer in here I need to turn on. If we come down to the timeline and turn on layer number 4, which is called Night Effects, we can see that everything in the background fills with green and has a slight distortion to it. That's because this layer has 2 filters, hue and saturation and mosaic applied. You can check that out if you want to. And that is affecting the color of the background. What I also have under switches and modes is I've got this Night Effects layer set to use the circle one that's above it as an alpha inverted matte. So the white circle should be cutting a hole through this layer beneath it. The reason it isn't is because at the moment this layer is turned on, and I did just want that turned on so you could see it in the center of the site. If I turn this off, you'll see now that you can see through the center of the site, and it's also very clear. That's because this area is now masked out. So if you just scrub again through the timeline, you can see the full strength and full color of the footage through the hole, but everything else around the outside is green. Well, obviously what we're going to do now is take this magnified area and put it inside the hole, so as soon as it zooms up over here, we can see the car in an enlarged view. And we're going to achieve that with a few very simple keyframes. So what I'll do is I'll come all the way back to the start of the timeline, and the first thing we'll need to do is make the size of our magnify area fit the size of the site. Now I know that the site itself is 50 pixels across, okay? I constructed it in Illustrator and that's the size I used initially. So I'm going to select the magnify solid here in the timeline and come back up to the effect controls window and change the size here from 61, which it is now, all the way down to 50 and say OK. So that now matches the size that we have for the site. And what about position? Well, obviously the site is already animated, okay? So we can easily take the animation keyframes from the position of the site and use those to drive the center point here for the magnify effect. So let's select the site target here in the timeline and hit the P key to access its position keyframes, and you can see there's just a few there. And all I'll do is I'll click on the word position to highlight all of them and hit Control C or Command C on the Mac to copy those into memory. If we then come down here to magnify solid, let's hit the E key to expose the magnify effect, twirl down its options, and we'll see right here is the center option. I can click on that and hit Control V or Command V and paste those keyframes in. And if I do a quick RAM preview of that, we can see now that the position of the magnify area perfectly matches the position of the site. Now obviously it reaches a certain point where the site then enlarges, but the magnify area stays at 50 pixels, so we need to enlarge that up to match at this particular point where it changes. But you can see up to this point, very simple effect all achieved through the magnify filter. So let's change those keyframes. Let's come back down to the timeline. And I'm just going to scroll up through the window here. Again, select the site target and hit the S key to show me the scale keyframes. And we can see those keyframes over here on the right-hand side. There's just 2 of them, which occur at 3 seconds and then zooms up over the course of 7 or 8 frames. So I'm just going to come to 3 seconds there. That's where we need to apply our first change to the magnify option. Again, let's just scroll up here and we can see that the size there is 50 pixels. So let's apply a keyframe for that. Let's scrub along to the very end point of the other animation, which obviously matches the center one that we have here. And let's change the size up there to 100 pixels and say OK. That's not quite there, so let's just drag that value up until it sits underneath the size that we have there. Around about 130 seems to finish that up quite nicely. If I just drag back a bit there, there's a slight gap that's happening there, and that's pretty much to do with just the easing of the keyframe. So have that last one selected and hit F9, and that will just smooth the motion into there, and that should now match pretty seamlessly. If I just hit 0, do a quick preview of that now, we can still see all the motion we had before. It moves across top left, it comes down, and then we'll have our zoom change. And all we need to do now is adjust the final property, which is the magnification itself. As soon as this site zooms up in size, I want to be able to actually see the magnification get bigger as well, as if it looks like we're really zooming up on it. So again, another very quick and easy setting. Let's take the time cursor back to 3 seconds. Again, this is where it's going to apply. And let's change the magnification here, which is 153 at this point. So apply a keyframe. Let's come out to the end point there and push that up to whatever value you feel is necessary. I'm going to go around 230. And don't forget, we have our soft effect applied to that, so it doesn't look very jagged. Again, one final preview of that small section. and we have the finished result. It reaches the corner and zooms up nice and big, and that pretty much highlights everything that's inside the magnify filter. You can see in certain cases, gives you some fun options to apply to your animation. Now obviously we've created all this animation using keyframes. A far easier way to do it would be to use expressions or script, and that would mean that we could take the information of position and scale from the site and use script to actually tell the magnify filter to alter its settings based on those properties. Now Brian's going to go over scripting in the very next set, and if you actually go to the motion tracking lesson on the final set of this training series, you'll actually see this project put together with the expressions when we're dealing with motion tracking, so you can always check that out later. But for now, that's the magnify effect. Now there's another really cool new distortion filter inside After Effects 6 called Warp, and any of you Photoshop users out there should recognize this as well. Joy is that we can now animate all of its properties inside After Effects. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to click to stop my preview and come all the way back to the beginning of my timeline. And I'm just going to scroll down here and tidy up this window as well. Let's close up any layers that we're currently using. And what we're going to do is turn on the top layer here, which is the logo for our movie. This is called Spy Brats 4. And what we have here is very simply an Illustrator logo, which we're going to use to apply our warp filter to. Now, just to make it easy to concentrate on, let's go ahead and solo that layer also. So that's the only one we can see. And let's just make sure that's selected inside our main window here, and then go into the effects. And let's just type in warp, and that will bring up all of our warp filters. And this is our new one here, the one that's just simply called warp. So again, let's just click and drag that to apply it to this layer. I'll bring up the effect controls for it. And you can see exactly what you would expect to see inside Photoshop. The layer has been distorted using a preset, which at this point is called arc. Now, if we click and drag on that, we can see a whole selection of different ways of applying changes to this. We obviously have upper and lower arc options. We have an overall arch, and any of these settings that we have, you can always increase the bend value just by clicking and dragging, which will allow you to distort these logos in very cool and easy ways. The very important thing to point out here is that we are doing this to an Illustrator layer, okay? It's a vector item, and we are now able to apply any effect that we need to a vector layer without having to worry about losing its quality, because we do have continuous rasterization turned on. It used to be in previous versions of After Effects that you couldn't do that. You could only apply effects to layers that did not have continuous rasterization turned on. Now let's just take the bend value down here. And again, you can go through and try any of these out that you want. These are all the same as you would expect to see inside of Photoshop. What I'm going to do is apply a couple of very simple animated keyframes to one of them. I'm going to choose Twist. This is the one I'm going to play with for now. Now, again, the bend value will obviously decide how distorted this is, and the more I drag it to a value of 100, we'll twist it round. But you see, you also have the ability to horizontally or vertically distort it. So you move basically the angle of distortion more towards one side or the other. So you see here my horizontal distortion makes it look very, very 3D. This is a really nice way to create rippled graphics in 3D. Now I'm just going to change my bend here. You can actually go in a minus value as well. So you can twist in the opposite direction. So we can go minus 100, even though my horizontal displacement is a plus 100. And again, vertically, we could also do the same. So you can even almost twist this thing around inside itself. Okay, we're not going to do that, but I did want to show you that value at the same time. So again, let's just undo that. And what we'll do is apply a couple of very quick keyframes here. So we'll animate the bend and the horizontal displacement here at 0 seconds. And I'm going to move my time indicator across to 2 seconds in the animation. Check that shows up here in your composition window. And let's change the properties to their absolute opposite. So I'm going to change the bend here from a negative to a plus. And let's change the horizontal from a plus to a negative. And then just hit 0 and do a RAM preview of that. And we can see the object slowly distorting over time based on the properties that we specified. Now, obviously, it will reach a middle point where it's straight. And then we'll start to bend around the other side again, because obviously in the middle it's going to reach 0 on both values. But what you'll notice there is the animation is very linear. It reaches the middle and kind of bangs and goes out. And obviously we can change the smoothness of that by easing those keyframes. So let's just click. Let's come down to the timeline and hit the U key to expose both of those keyframe values for bend and horizontal distortion. I'm going to click and drag to select all 4 of those and hit F9 to just smooth that motion out. If I just scrub this down a little bit, we can do a final RAM preview of that, and you'll see the motion now stays a little bit more gentle. It eases itself out and approaches the middle point. And if we wanted to, we could also apply a keyframe at the middle point and apply ease to that as well. But we can see here that that F9 key has smoothed the motion at the start and the end of this animation and shows the warp filter to its very easy form. Okay, let's try a different distortion effect now on the same logo. So I'm just going to click down here to stop my preview, and I'm going to click on the warp filter here and just hit delete. First thing it'll do is obviously remove the keyframes because I had those selected. Hit delete again and it'll remove the filter. So now we're just back to the layer as it was. Let's come up to the effects palette here and look for the name of our new one, which is called Turbulent Displace. So let's type in the word turb and it will come up with that filter. Again, you can click and drag or double click it to apply it to that layer. And again, we have a basic deformation of the layer. Now this is done using noise. The way that this filter works is very similar to having fractal noise and using that as a displacement map. So if I hit the 0 key at this point and do a preview, there is a basic pattern of fractal noise beneath this, but there is no animation to it, okay? There's two ways that we can animate and I'll show you both of them. Again, I'll just click to stop the preview and let's have a look at the settings. So we're using turbulent displace at this point. We also have bold, which is a much wider noise. We have twist. Again, each one of these affects it in a very different way. We also have smoother options rather than such a hard noise. It'll be a little bit smoother. But quite interestingly down here, the last three we have are vertical displacement only. So it only pushes the layer up. You see the edges are staying straight. Likewise, we have horizontal. And we also have cross displacement, which kind of pushes both at the same time, but again, using very set angles. Well, I am going to go straight back to the original of just turbulent for now. And we can have the amount here, which will obviously choose how much of it is distorted. So the higher I push that, the more effect is applied and it will bend these paths around a little bit more. So be careful not to push that too far, but you know that the value is there. You also have, importantly here, the size. This is the size of the noise itself and almost how detailed it is. Detail itself is defined by complexity, but the size of the noise, it's kind of drawn in big clumps of color, and this will define how big that is. So if you make it smaller, you will get more displacements. If you make it bigger, you will get less because it will be actually bigger chunks of color, say one around here in the corner and one down here. Whereas if we go all the way down to the bottom here, a very small amount, you can almost make it look like this is being animated on water as if it's kind of floating. Now, like I said, complexity will also increase the number of grays in that. So if we do increase the complexity, you'll get more and more breaks in it as if it's breaking it up using a liquid. Or again, if we go the opposite way, you could actually go almost all the way down to 0, but 1 is the default setting. 1 is just the smallest amount of complexity that we can apply. So if you want to adjust after that, you would go back to size and do so. Okay, so we can specify all of these settings, but at this point, none of them are animated. Now, we could animate the size as well to do this kind of motion. You see, as I'm dragging back and forth, we are getting some sort of preview there, but animating the size will not really do animation. All it's going to do is say we start with a smaller amount of noise, and we get to a bigger amount of noise. And if that's the effect you want, that's just great. However, we have two options here for animating correctly. The first of which we have here is the evolution. Now, I tend to think of this as the noise that's underneath the layer itself, almost as if it's got water or a liquid that's bubbling underneath it and the layer is rippling on top of it. Okay, so the layer itself doesn't really appear to move. It looks like it's actually being bubbled and pulled around from underneath, as opposed to maybe having a gust of wind blown at it and being moved around from the side. So that's what I would use the evolution for. And like some of the other effects we've seen, you can always go to evolution options and apply a cycle to that. So you could apply a seamless loop and have this constantly move on an up and down basis using a perfect scene. Okay. Well, I'm not going to use that for now. I'll just go back, close that up. The offset value here is the turbulence offset. Now the turbulence, as we've said, is the fractal noise. And we can define how that actually moves through the scene. And if it moves through, it will obviously pick up the item and move it along as if it's being blown from one side. Okay, so as I drag that point further in either direction, I'm actually dragging on the values here in the palette, or I can pick up the point here inside the comp window itself and pull that and move it around. And now we'll be able to treat it more as if there is something moving through it and it's a flag that's flying in the wind. Okay, so very simple and easy effect to do. Now, a couple of other options you have inside this palette which are important. We have a pinning option. Depending on the size of your layer, this layer was actually, as an original, if I turn off the effect, the original layer was actually bigger than the pixels itself, so we don't really notice a desire to pin. What pin actually means is if we apply the turbulent displace, even though the edges are being displaced around the edge of the layer, the corner points, let's say if the yellow went up to here, would actually be held in place. So the ripple would only apply everywhere else in the center apart from the very, very corners. Well, obviously, if you don't want that, you can come to the pin options here and turn them off, or you can pin the horizontal or vertical on the left side and that kind of thing. So if you do want to do something like a flag flying, you could always say, let's pin the left side, the whole left side of the layer would stay as it is and only the right side would move up and down. So those are a few options there. Another important thing, obviously, is the anti-aliasing. We're set to low anti-aliasing at the moment. We could set that to high quality so that when we do then start to displace, we get very, very smooth effects on top of that. Now that pretty much highlights the turbulent displace. It's a fun filter to use. Let's just go and turn it on and get a final preview of that. It's nice and smooth. Feel free to go through and animate that to your heart's content, but you can see there, just by using the magnify and also by using turbulent displace, you've got some great tools for distortion animation. Okay, I'm going to close the effect controls window down now and actually close this whole composition down and look at the next distortion tool, which is liquify. This is here inside project number 6, so double click to open that. And what I can see here is a piece of video footage that I've keyed out on a background. And what I've done, just for ease, I've put the original in the background, just slightly tinted back, because we're going to use the liquify filter over here on the right-hand figure. And if I do a preview of that, basically what we'll see is any distortion applying to the right-hand side, and we can just marry it up to the original version on the left, just so we can check everything as we go along. So it's a very simple project, just a keyed head. What we're going to do is apply liquify to this right-hand one. So what we'll do is let's just click over here on the right-hand side and select that top layer, and then come over to the effects palette and let's just type in LIQ, and that will bring up liquify. Again, double click to apply it and bring up the new effect controls for this. Now again, anyone who uses Photoshop will recognize all of these tools. They're almost identical. There's a couple of different ones in here, but the way that the filter works is exactly the same. It's basically going to be used to distort and push and pull and bend and twist the pixels inside our image, and obviously we can add keyframes to that, so there's a lot of fun to be had here. Now the first thing is if we look at the tool options here, I can see that I have a default brush size of 64, which I think is what it's set to in Photoshop as well, and we also have a brush pressure of 50%. Now the pressure means how much of the effect is applied when I click and hold the mouse, or if I click and drag the mouse. Now when you're doing something like distortion using the liquify tool, using a lower pressure is pretty advisable because you can always start slow and build it up to the effect you want, and then you can stop at the right point. If you have brush pressure set to 100%, as soon as you click, the maximum amount of effect will be applied. The only time you might set that to 100 is if we're using the reconstruct tool to put back the original image. Okay, so we'll get to that in just a second. Now the brush size here is set to 64. If I put my cursor on screen, you can see that. What's quite cool is on the PC, if I hold down the Control key, or on the Mac, I hold down the Command key, I can click and drag to the left or to the right and define the size of my brush. So I can actually change this as I go along. I don't need to use the palette for this every single time, okay? So I can go to a fairly small size brush somewhere around there. All right, and I've set that. If we come back here and look at the tools themselves, there's obviously a selection of them. The first one I have is called the Warp tool. Okay, now if I select that, you can see here that my options change to the Warp tool options. The brush size is reflecting what I have selected, and again, my pressure is set to 50. What does Warp do? Well, very simply, it pushes pixels out of the way. If we come over here to our image, I'm literally just going to click and drag and start pushing. And all I'm doing is pushing a very small amount as if I'm painting. So I'm using multiple strokes here to push the side of this image up, almost as if I'm giving this character some horns. Okay, so I've just drawn that up on the left-hand side. So you can see how easy it is to distort the pixels in an image. But what about animation? Well, what we could have done is specify it so that these distortions apply over time and we see the horn actually grow out of the head. Well, let's do that for the one over on this side, okay? The way to do that is come over here to the effect controls, and let's come down here to the distortion mesh, okay? If I just expand that out there, we can see that we have the distortion mesh and we also have the offset. I'll get to the offset in just a second. But if we apply a keyframe here for the distortion mesh, and that's at 0 seconds, if we now scrub our timeline along maybe to 15 frames, and now bring our warp tool back in and start making some changes, anything that happens in between those two will now be smoothly interpolated by After Effects and allow this to show up as an animation. We can see there's the second horn. Okay, that'll do for now. If I just scrub back and forward in my timeline, you can see there that you've applied a nicely liquefied warp animation over time, making it look like there is a horn growing out of the skin here. See how easy it is. Now that's just using the warp tool. There's obviously different options in here as well. We have what's called the turbulence tool here. And this one will basically push the pixels around using a noise. It's very similar to the turbulent displace that we saw a second ago, but imagine it being applied as a brush. So we do have what's called here the turbulent jitter, which is the amount of noise that's being applied at one time. So let's give that a quick try. I'm actually going to take my timeline out again to 15 frames so that any changes we make now will apply at 15, so the original image will stay as it is and then animate to our new state. And what I'll do is I'll again just hold down my control or the command key and just drag a slightly larger brush here. And let's take maybe this eyebrow area and I'm just going to click and hold on it. And you can see as I click and hold, there's a slight displacement going on. Okay, the longer I hold it down, the more it actually applies, but you'll see this movement up and down. There's actually a slight bump in that, and I can always hit the period key and zoom up on that to double check. You can see the path goes up and down. Well, that's all based on the noise that I just specified. So my turbulent jitter is 70 at this point, which is actually quite large. If we come back to the palette and maybe reduce that down to a smaller amount, maybe 20 or 30, do bear in mind this is not going to change what's been applied. What has been applied is set. We can't actually adjust that once it's been applied. We can erase it and reinstate it back to its original form, but as it's been painted, it is set in stone. But now that we've got a turbulent jitter of 20, I can click on there now, and you see it's actually pulling a little bit more detail into these areas just by holding that brush down. Okay, so there's a lot of fun to be had with these things, depending on the settings that we apply. Now again, let me zoom down just a touch. We can see all the changes going on. We're getting a lovely set of distortion here on this image. And obviously, if we scrub our timeline there, we can see those changes happening over that first 15 frames. Okay. Let's come back over here. We have two twirl tools next, both of which work exactly the same way apart from just opposite directions. So we have twirl clockwise and we have twirl anti-clockwise. Again, it's based on the brush and the pressure as well. So if we come over here and maybe choose this eye, just click and hold on it. It will obviously twist to the right-hand side because I have a clockwise option selected. Let me just undo that and maybe come down here and choose the bottom of the lip. We can distort the teeth there. Very easy. Looks like someone's just biting on their lip. Now that's a cool thing you can do with this tool. It's not just made to distort things and have a bit of fun. You can actually use this obviously for fully professional jobs by making changes to a piece of footage that just you want to change the expression slightly. You want to make someone look like they're biting their lip. You want to push their cheeks slightly higher so they have more of a smile. This can all be done with a liquify tool. So don't think that it's all just fun and games. It's a very professional option. Now, as well as having the twirl, we also have a couple of fun ones, which are the pucker tool and also the bloat tool. And these are similar to the ones that you would find in Illustrator as well. If we come here to the pucker options, again, brush size is all dependent, but this will actually squeeze the pixels down and make them smaller. So you can bring someone's eye down or make them look like they're blinking, that kind of thing. Reduce the size of their nose. All of these things are being done as an animation, don't forget. If you scrub your timeline at any point, all of this is applying across time. We've got some very fun imagery going on here. And likewise, if we go back and this time select the bloat tool, let's maybe take the chin over here and let's just enlarge that so it grows in size. Just push that out a little bit on each side. And obviously you can have some good fun if you're using a Wacom tablet for this as well, because you feel like you're actually painting that image, but you're painting on video. This is happening with motion. Okay, so we can see there in 15 frames, the amount of damage that we've done to this shot is pretty interesting. Now there's a few little tools left to have a look at. Let's come over here. Now this one that we have here is called the Shift Pixel tool. Now what this one does is actually pushes pixels perpendicular to the stroke direction. It's a little bit strange to get used to, but let me try a smaller brush size for this. And literally if I click and drag, say on this eye and drag to the right, the pixels will actually go in a slightly different direction. It might be worth just coming here to the brush pressure and let's push that all the way up to 100%. Again, select the tool. Let's come back in. There we go. You see as I drag to the left, the pixels are pushed to the right. If I drag to the right, the pixels are pushed to the left. So this tool has a certain amount of uses, although it's quite difficult to get to grips with because it almost works in opposite to what you're doing. But again, that certainly has its function depending on the image that you're playing with. Now we also have another one over here, which is the reflection tool. Let's go and select that one. And this one is almost like a clone tool. It's not officially a clone tool because we have one here, but this one actually takes a copy of certain pixels that you click on and copies them into the area that you're currently painting with. So you can actually use this for very simple retouching. Okay, you can see I have a darker area there, but I'm pulling in the pixels around it to retouch it just by simply clicking. So the central crosshair you see there, the pixels of that point are being picked up and then distributed into the rest of the sides of the brush. So you can use it for a little bit of retouching if you maybe want an effect shot where you've got someone's skin has got some lines in it, you want those lines to close up, you could quite easily use this tool to do it. Now, a lot of people take the next tool at its face value and say, great, this is the clone tool. Okay, now it's called the clone tool, but it works in a completely different way. All right, now clone tool, you would normally think, let's pick up all the pixels that are over here and copy them down here. So I could maybe take someone's nose and copy it into the eye. The clone tool inside the liquify option works completely differently in that it clones the effect settings that you've got into a different area. Okay, so let's say I've taken this left-hand eye, we've done all the change effects that we have, and I like all the settings. I've got no physical way of copying those and applying them over here. Well, this is what the clone tool is for. I'm going to change the pressure again back down to around 50, just so everything's not applied immediately. And again, I'll hold down Control or Apple and give myself a slightly larger brush. And then what I'll do is, just like you would in Photoshop, I'm going to hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click to take a sample of that area. So now it's taken a sample of the effects or the distortion that's been applied. I can now let go of that key and come over to this eye and click and start building. And you'll see the more I build, it actually builds onto this eye. It's actually distorting this one using the same settings that I have on the left side. Now it's only applying it to 50% there. I can obviously click on top of that and apply more. Okay, so I'm adding 50% more on top of that original, and we now have two distorted using the same effects. Obviously they'll look different because the footage is slightly different from side to side, but that is the way that the clone tool works. It just simply copies distortion from one location to another. Now once we've reached this point, obviously we've got 15 frames of animation here where the person's face is distorted from one point to another. We may decide that we don't like part of it. I don't want that eye to be distorted as it was. I want it to be more like the original. Well, this is where the final tool comes in. This is the reconstruct tool, and it does exactly what it says. It reconstructs the image back to its original form. Now again, you have a brush size setting, which I'm pretty happy with that, and again a pressure of 54. If we're using the standard reconstruct option here, which is revert, I might want to set that to 100%. So I'm guaranteed that as soon as I start painting, I revert back to my original version. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Again, we're at 15 pixels across here. I'm going to click and drag on that, and you see as soon as I paint on it, it's restored back to its original state. Okay, if we just drag back and forth there, you can see that that side of the face remains untouched. However, there's another way that this tool works, and if we look at the reconstruct options again, we have three further items. The first one we have is displace. Now this one allows us to reconstruct parts of the image, but it keeps the displacement of the area that we're going over. So basically it means any twirls or any scale changes will be reverted, but any displacement that's pushed in either direction can actually stay. So it's almost like a temporary or a not complete revert tool. It only reverts certain parts of it, okay? So if I go over that, we're actually reverting, as you can see, the twisted areas, but you'll see that the eye, which was originally pushed up using the warp tool and the displace functions, has been left in that new position because we used displace, which leaves any displaced pixels in that original shape. Okay, so that's quite a handy little tool. It almost allows you to undo certain things, but not others. Now the other two options we have under here, we have the amply twist option and the affine option, both of which really reconstruct the areas to match all the local distortions that exist at the starting point or the point that you click on, including displacement, rotation, scaling, and skewing. So it's very similar to the revert tool, but works in a different way. So I'd advise you to try those out, but I normally find for most of the things I'm doing that revert and displace will do most of the work for me. Now the final thing I want to point out here is the distortion mesh. We haven't really seen anything on this yet, so let's have a look at its options. If I come down here to the bottom of the palette, we have three settings here. The first one of which is the distortion mesh itself, which you can see was animated, and that's what gives us our 15 frames of animation. But we can choose to view that mesh if we want to by coming up here to the view options, dropping that down, and we'll see the first item in there is view mesh. So go ahead and turn that on, and you'll see a very fine and very distorted gray mesh appear around the front of the image. Now gray is obviously not the ideal color to use, so you can come here and choose mesh color. Go ahead and choose a different one, and yellow is always a good one to see the amount of displacement that we have. Now you also have mesh size option here as well. We're set to medium at the moment, and large will open that up and see it a little bit more clearly, but not as fine. But you can see there very easily how much of the layer has been displaced using any number of filters that we've been working with, and obviously expanded down here at the bottom. If you wish to, you can go down to a small mesh and see that very, very fine. I would suggest working at 100% size or even bigger and full quality when you're doing that, because we are down in resolution and quality here. We're seeing a bit of a pattern in there. So I would probably work at medium at this point and then just go fine if I'm working at a larger size. Now what's quite interesting about the distortion mesh, if we come down to the bottom of the palette, is we have two options. We have a distortion percentage. Now even though we've made all of our changes to this layer by dragging the points out and twisting them and pulling them, we can actually fine tune that down. If we like everything that we've done but it's just a bit too heavy, instead of going back and reconstructing it all, we can come here to distortion and drag the percentage down, and it will actually reduce the overall displacement. So we can choose a percentage at which we are happy, so we don't have to apply it at its full value. So that's a very handy one. I'm just going to set that back up to 100 again, but you can see you can go beyond that. Okay, you can go, in fact, all the way up to 200%. So if the distortion that you've done is not quite enough, no fear, you can go beyond 100% to do that. Okay, do bear that in mind. It will expand quite a long way when you do that. But again, 100 is a good point. But this is the interesting one, the distortion mesh. The mesh itself has a default position on the layer, and it obviously has these points that have been displaced now using our tools. Well, we can pick the distortion mesh up at any time, its X or Y values, and drag them, and you'll see that the mesh moves through the image. Now, this image is based on an alpha channel, don't forget. It's been keyed out across a background. So if I turn the mesh off here and drag that value back and forth, you'll see that the effect works its way through the graphic, almost as if the image itself is made of liquid or a molten substance, and you get this really nice ripple effect, and that could be a very cool way of doing special effects, just by simply adjusting the mesh to any specific value and doing a few splats of paint and a few twirls and displacements, and then animating that value moving through the character as they're talking. You've seen this effect in a lot of films, and this is one easy way that it can be achieved. Now, a little bit later on, you'll see me show you a lesson on how to use the motion tracker inside of After Effects. You could use the motion tracker for a project like this, where you could actually track the distortion mesh point to the motion track information and keep any displacement that you've applied to someone's face actually moving with them as they move inside the scene. So if you've gone to all the trouble of distorting someone's mouth or eyes, if their head moves to the left or to the right, obviously it'd be great to keep all that information together. So you could literally use motion tracking to hold the distortion mesh onto their face, and you get a really simple way of working through that kind of project. And of course, the motion tracker is a production bundle effect. We'll be showing you that in set 4. Now, one thing I just want to point out as well about this effect before we finish up this lesson is if we come back to the top, let's say that you've done all of these changes and maybe this whole effect shot is 5 or 6 seconds long and you've got something like 50 keyframes in there, which are points where the animation changes. If you wanted to reset everything and lose all of the distortion that you've done and start again, you don't have to lose the keyframes. If I hit the reset value up here, that will only reset all of the displacement. You can see that there's none left now. However, if we come down to the timeline and hit the U key, we can see that the distortion mesh keyframes are still in place. So all of those keyframes could still be contained in there, and you can just simply work from one to the other and just repaint in your effects using the liquify tool. So again, it's just one of those handy things. You might hit reset and think, oh no, I've lost all of that work and all those keyframe changes, which are very important for my effect shot. You don't have to worry. So it's kind of a safety buffer there, just in case you hit it. But you can see there that the liquify effect, as well as the other distortion tools we've looked at, give you some really cool animation functions, and this is all new inside of AE6.